We will now match the graph of the functions which are given in red color with the graph of its derivatives. We have been given the four derivatives in blue color. So we will match the functions with their derivatives. And for this, we will be utilizing these concepts related to the graphs of f of x and f prime of x. So whenever the f of x, that is the graph of f of x as increasing interval, it's the graph of the f prime of x, that is its derivative graph, will be positive. And wherever it has decreasing intervals, its derivative graph will be negative. And whenever we see a horizontal tangent on the graph of f of x, its derivative graph is 0. And we have sharp turns or curves or corner on the graph of f of x. The graph of f prime of x will be unbounded. So we will utilize these facts to help in our process. We now choose the graph of the f of x in part A with the graph of its derivatives. So I'm going to move the graph as like I can match it with one of the graphs of the derivatives. So first, let me see if could this graph, that is the graph in part 4, could be the graph of the derivative of f of x. So let's utilize these facts. We see increasing intervals. I'm going to do it like this. We put this in some other color. This is basically a decreasing interval from this point to this point. Till this point, the graph of f of x is decreasing, which means on the same interval, the graph of its derivative should be negative. No, it is positive over here. So this is clearly positive. This is clearly positive. So this is not the graph of this f of x. So now let's move on to the next one. Let me move it on to this graph in part 3. So here, let's do the analysis. We have the decreasing interval from this point to this point. So till this point, it is decreasing, which means around the same interval, the graph of the f of x, that is f prime of x, has to be negative. Yes, clearly these are all negative values, which is below the x-axis. So it seems like this could be the graph. And let's continue. Now let me look at so there is one more decreasing interval. Even after this, the graph of f of x is decreasing. So around that same interval, I can say that the graph of its derivative is still negative. So this is clearly negative. So this is possible. And after, that is between this interval, from this interval to this interval, uh, it is uh, uh, it is increasing as well as it is clearly increasing. So it should be positive. The graph of the f of x, the derivative graph, it should be positive, which we can clearly see from here. From here, it is positive. And now let's use the fact horizontal tangent. So let me just clear this up. Okay, I have cleared my markings to have further analysis. Now let's utilize this fact, that is the horizontal tangent. Clearly we can see that we have a horizontal tangent at this point as well as at this point, which means its derivative graph has to be 0. So let's draw a same line on this point. So clearly it is 0 here as well as it is 0 here. So this conforms with all the properties of the graph of f of x and the graph of f prime of x. So this means this is the graph of the part 3 is the graph of the derivative of the graph in part A. So we can write down here for A, it is part 3 graph. We now choose the derivative graph for the graph given in part B. So here I have the graph of part B. We can use the fact that wherever the graph of f of x has sharp turns or curves or corners, the graph of its derivative should be unbounded. So clearly only one graph has unbounded graph. So which means this is the graph. You can clearly see that if we match this graph with this graph given in part 1, around this point, that is, we have a sharp corner or a curve like this. So in this interval or at this point, its derivative graph is unbounded. So clearly this is the graph of the derivative uh, for the graph of f of x. So we write down part B is matching with 1. Let's continue for the graph given in part C. So at this time we have only a choice between the graph in part 2 or part 4. So let me see if this matches with part 4. So here I can see this is a decreasing interval from this point to this interval. The graph of f of x is decreasing. So around this point it has to be negative, but the graph of f prime of x, that is the derivative graph, is positive as well as negative. So definitely this is not the one, which means we only have a choice. It should be the graph of part 2. So let's analyze this. It is decreasing, and just remove this. This is decreasing till this point, which means the graph of derivative has to be negative. So clearly this is negative, and after which it is increasing, so it has to be positive. So clearly this is positive above the x-axis. So therefore this graph given in part 2 is the derivative graph of the given graph in part C. So we can write part C matches with part 2. And so while doing this party, we don't have much choice. It has to be the graph of part 4. So anyway, we will have a bit of analysis to see if this matches with these concepts. So we are seeing an increasing interval from this point to this point. So around this, it has to be positive. And we also see that it is increasing over here. So these are the two intervals. So you can see that from this interval, these two intervals, its graph has to be positive, which we can clearly see over here. So this is positive as well as this is positive. And let's now look at the decreasing interval. So this interval is decreasing as well as this interval is decreasing. Clearly around that interval, the graph of the derivative is negative as well as it is negative over here. And now let's look at the horizontal tangents. We have horizontal tangent at here, here, as well as at this point. So around these points, we have this graph of its derivative is 0. So clearly it is 0 here, as well as, yeah, it is 0 over here. So around this point, 3 points, the graph of the derivative is 0 whenever the graph of f of x has horizontal tangent. So it matches with all the concepts. So therefore, part D matches with graph given in part 4. So these are the answers to this question.